Welcome to the lecture on visual rhetoric and composition, specifically on the rhetoric and composition of photos. Thank you for your patience with the move to our online format. I hope this lecture is pretty succinct, so you can go about the activity that I have planned for you. I do want to let you know that the video will go a little bit back and forth on a few things, so I will be switching between different tabs up here at different times to show you various things and to show you your assignment. So don't be thrown off if you see the screen shift and things like that, okay? And of course you can always go back and rewind or ask me any questions that you have. That's 100% okay. All right, so let's dive into it. Today we're talking about visual rhetoric, and that's sort of what our last unit is about. If you've already watched the lecture on your last project, the visual rhetorical analysis, you'll know that a lot of our last unit is going to be talking about the rhetoric of visuals, so photos, videos, and graphics mostly. And so today we're gonna just start opening up and start having that conversation about what that entails and what those might be. But a few things that I want you to sort of remember about rhetoric in general is that, or a few things I want you to know is that the rhetoric of visuals in many ways works in similar ways to the rhetoric we do when we're writing text, when we're writing words on a page. So I wrote a few things down here just for you to remember as we move through all of this. And the first thing I want you to remember is that visuals, like photos and graphics and videos, are conveying messages and information just like text do. So our definition of rhetoric was how a message is constructed, conveyed, and received. Well, that applies to visuals as well. So in some ways they're very similar in that they also both have rhetorical features, just like, or visuals have rhetorical features just like text as well. That's what we're going to be going over today, are some different features that are very common to photos. And those features, just like in text, shape how an audience reads the visuals and understands the subject, which you may be very familiar with as people who see visuals all day, every day. How a visual is constructed will really shape how an audience views that thing. Another thing that I want everybody to sort of remember as we move through is that, like, the decision to include some information and exclude some information from visuals impacts how we view the subject as well. And we're going to see that theme come up a lot as we look through examples today. Like the fact that we can see the crowd in a sports photo changes how we view the subject, or the fact that we can only see the person's face, right? So those sorts of things also play heavily into how an audience will understand the subject ultimately. All right, so getting onto some of the really common rhetorical features of photography. Now, these are often called different things. I call them the rhetorical features of photography because that's the language we've been using to talk about writing as well. But some people call these like guidelines for photography or rules for photography. In my mind, they're just sort of rhetorical features. You can use them as they're effective for you and choose not to, and that sort of, and shape them and change them or break them, or that sort of thing. It's sort of up to you, but we'll dive into these. These are pretty common, and I'm going to toggle back and forth between this great link that talks about them a little bit, which I'll share with you as well, so that you can sort of see exactly what I'm talking about, right? The first section of these rules, or these rhetorical features of photography, is related to composition. And composition is just how things are arranged within the frame of a photo. So where is everything in there, right? And the biggest sort of rule, you may have heard it if you've ever talked about photography with anyone, is what's called the rule of thirds in photography. And this is just the idea that whatever your subject is should be positioned somewhere within these types of lines. If you create a line right down here and a line here and two lines across, the subject of your photo should run along these lines somewhere, right? So you see the subject of this photo, this tree, runs along this line and is intersecting with this line. It's really great if you can get it to intersect, if you can, your subject is at an intersection of these lines. And I'll show you that here in a second. But you can see here's another example from over here, this architecture right here, right? In sports, this is also a commonly followed rule. You'll see our sports photograph right here. This player is the subject. So is this. There's sort of one player running at another. This player runs along the line that would go vertically here. This player runs along a line that would go vertically here. Okay, so this is a well-balanced photo that follows this rule of thirds that is often talked about. And what the rule of thirds does is it keeps things, rhetorically speaking, to your audience, it keeps things balanced, and it allows things to not exist in spaces that would feel off-putting to the audience. So if this guy was all the way over here, and this guy was all the way over here, then the thing would feel really weirdly spaced to anybody looking at it. Right? So our second rhetorical feature of photography are leading lines. This is one of my favorites. It's a classic photo of Roger Bannister, I think. What you see here are these lines that sort of lead you to the subject, right? And that's what leading lines are. They're just lines within the photo that somehow draw the eye to the subject. I'll show you where that is right here. You'll notice I'm not going in the order that they go in. But here's a good example, right? These lines on the walkway here lead straight to the Eiffel Tower. This road ultimately leads to this tree, which is the subject of the photo, right? So what leading lines do is they draw the audience's eye to a particular subject, right? So you'll notice too that I have little numbers by these. Those numbers correspond to where these photos are in the list of the Sports Illustrated 100 Greatest Photos of All Time. That's where I got these photos. So if you need to go look at them again, you can do that. The third rule we're going to talk about is the rule of space. This rule is generally that if you have a subject that's moving in a particular direction in a photo, you should give them space in that direction. Right? So you'll see down here, they use an example of a boat going down a canal or whatever. And you see the boat's going this way, so they give the boat a lot of space over here, right? A lot of space over this way. In our example, you see Tiger Woods teeing off, and you see there's a bunch of space out in front where the ball would be heading. This is very common in sports, in all photography, but in sports photography especially, where teams move in particular directions or action moves in particular directions. You see leading space used to give space for the ball or for the action to take place. Right? Balance is just the idea that things have, or that a photo has roughly the same amount of weight in a given space or within its frame on each side, you know? So the example they use here, right, are like this lamp post and this thing, this tower, right? You don't see everything on one side of the photo and nothing on the other, right? Because that would feel unbalanced. The example that I use here is this Joe Namath photo, where imagine there were no people sitting over in this chair and no one standing over here, and all of the stuff was taking place just on this side of the photo. Then that photo would feel very unbalanced. But because we have a few people over here as well, it feels balanced. And that balance can be important when an audience is looking at a photo. That way they don't feel put off by like the fact that the photo is so unbalanced. If that makes sense. Okay. Fill the frame is a technique where you just essentially, it is what it says. You fill the frame with the subject. Instead of making the frame overly large and adding the context of all other things that might be inside of it, you fill the frame with just the subject. This gives us a sense that the subject in some way takes up the entirety of the space and creates a sense of like enormity. So this photo here is of Juan Marichal, and he's taking up the entirety of the frame because his leg kick is so wild and he's got this huge odd leg kick, right? And so the audience then gets the perception that leg kick is so exaggerated that it fills the entirety of the frame, right? Filling the frame can give a sense of significance or importance or grandioseness, if that's a word, to your subject. Right? They use a subject in here, I think they do fill the frame with like a lion or something like that, which creates this like sense of majesty in some ways. Here we go. See, they have this lion's face entirely filling the frame. Now, if you fill the frame, you lose context for what might be happening outside of that. So we see the lion's face here, but we can't see anything outside of that. I don't know if that lion is in a zoo. I don't know if they found it in the wild. I don't know what's going on around it at all. Maybe the rest of its body is entirely shaved. I wouldn't know, because all I see is its face. And the same goes for Marichal here. I can see that he's got this wild leg kick, but for all I know, he's warming up right now. He's not actually playing in a game. He's just warming up to throw. But I can't tell because I get just the full frame. So it gives you something, but it takes something away as well. Frame within a frame is the next concept, or next rhetorical feature of photography that we see. And we'll go back to the Tiger Woods photo here because it's a good example of that as well. Where you see the audience coming right here, creating a frame within the larger frame of the photo. So it's framing the subject with some other frame that's in the photo. Here the gallery is framing Tiger Woods. Their example of frame within a frame is easier because it's stationary, it's architecture. So you see, like right here, here's an archway that's framing this tower, right? Archway frames the tower. That's a frame within a frame. And it's just another move that provides some context for what's taking place sometimes, if you want to try that, right? So we get the frame of the audience here, so we get the context of having the audience and Tiger Woods right there. Depth and foregrounding is a rhetorical feature that's used very frequently as a way of saying, like, as a way of making the subject the clearest and most prominent thing while providing some sort of context and a background that would give us a broader context. In the example that we have here, we have Brandi Chastain right after she kicked a very important goal for the U.S. women's national team. And we see her celebrating in the foreground, and that's the most important thing. But the background, the depth that we see of her teammates charging towards her to celebrate, adds more information to the photo that we get to see and help us understand this context, right? This is done all the time in sports, in part because the subjects that people focus on are often very far away from things that are around them. So when somebody shoots an athlete, a photo of an athlete, the athlete will be very clear, and then the background will be very blurry-ish because the background's very far away, right? But it can create depth, a sense of depth, and a sense of what's going on in the background can provide context for that subject. Okay? Does that make sense? So these are the compositional elements of photography, the rhetorical features of photography. And they're very common. I haven't gone over all of them. You'll see that this website I showed you, or this webpage, has more. But I showed you the ones, but these are the ones that I find most important and that you'll come across most frequently. Another element besides composition is viewpoint, or point of view, right? And that's just someone's angle relative to the subject. So are you above the subject? Are you eye level with the subject? Are you below the subject, right? And you can see the ways in which this changes how an audience perceives the subject, right? So if we look at a low viewpoint, for example, watching Dr. J throw down a dunk, we can see that this adds a sense of like majesty to Dr. J. He seems very heroic, very, what's the word I'm looking, superhuman almost, flying through the air because he's above us, right? Anytime you shoot from that angle, things look a particular way. For example, some filmmakers, Steven Spielberg, for example, often shoots his movies from the eye level of a child, so he'll be looking up at adults slightly because he wants his audience to have the perspective of a child when they're seeing the thing, right? The same is true here. If you change the angle, you really change the perception for how someone sees something. Here's a high angle shot from a high point of view. And you can see how this looks almost dangerous because we're so high, right? These fans are like leaning over the edge of something and we're like, oh man, you're really high up there. So yeah, that's what a high point of view can look like. And then here's an eye level shot, right? Now you'll notice these two people are on the ground, but eye level is still considered wherever their eyes are. They're the subject, so their eye level is down. So whoever's taking this shot got down on the ground to shoot what was taking place here, okay? Eye level can often allow us the opportunity to get emotional shots like this one, because now we can see people's faces very clearly, okay? Another element to the rhetoric of photography is lighting, right? You don't need to know too much about lighting. For our purposes anyway, if you get really into photography, you can start learning more about how to create certain types of lighting. But for our purposes, it's important to remember that we view things, that light provides us opportunities to see certain things, and darkness provides opportunities to not see certain things, right? So if we cast more light on something, we're going to be able to see it better. And it's also going to look more triumphant to us or something like that. We tend to associate light with good and dark with not good, right? And so adding or subtracting light can in some ways provide more information about something because we can see it now better, or give us a sense that something is happier or better, whereas dark can do the opposite. There are such things in photography called hard lighting and soft lighting. You don't really have to know about that, but if you're interested, hard lighting is when you have like stark contrasts in light, and soft lighting is when light covers everything without these stark contrasts. And the photo I'm showing you here, after a boxing match had ended, it's a black and white photo, and it's a good example of all these things I'm talking about, of how light provides certain information in good ways and darkness takes certain information, right? Or makes us feel certain ways about things. So in this photo, you see this boxer who's been beaten and his trainer over the top of him. Now there's a light really far behind the subject, and that's creating this shadow on the losing team here, the losing side. And that makes it feel like, oh, they are the losing side because they have this shadow on them. You really get the sense of the sadness that they feel as a result of losing, right? In contrast, you look at this guy over here who has just won the fight, and he's cast in all this light. He looks so happy, and there's so much light all over him, right? That's a very obvious sort of way that light can be used, right? Now, this is also an example of hard light because you see these stark contrasts here between light and dark. Yeah, that's because he's so far away from the light source. And that sort of gives us this sense of harsh lighting. If you get more into photography, they'll tell you that sometimes they'll say soft light is better than hard light. Not necessarily, right? If you know how to use hard light well, like this photo does, then it can be a good thing, right? You have a subject here who's cast in shadow, and yet the shadow is helping, right? So think about it in a rhetorical sense more so than in a this is good and this is bad sense. Another element is the use of color. Often color can be used to draw contrast and attention to particular things. There's a photo here of Serena Williams, and you can see the lime green of her tennis outfit is really providing a ton of contrast with her background as well as her skin tone. And so while we may be focusing on the subject of her face, the emotion that's coming from it, the lime green of the tennis outfit can really pop as we move through and see this photo. That might be like, whoa, what's that? And that stark contrast can draw our attention. Okay. Shot types. There are a few different shot types in terms of how close you are to your subject. This is related to how the distance of the photo, right? So you've heard of things like close-ups and extreme close-ups. They talk about them in film all the time. Those exist in photography, right? I don't have examples here of extreme close-ups or close-ups, mostly because they aren't done very frequently in sports photography. Extreme close-ups are something like just someone's eyes would be an extreme close-up, or just their hands would be an extreme close-up. A close-up would be like shoulders and above, and you can see why that's not done very frequently in sports, right? If we remember that the more information you let into the photo, the more your audience will know about it. Well, if you do an extreme close-up of an athlete's eyes or their hands, for example, how will you even know that person's an athlete? You know? An athlete's eyes don't look any different than anybody else's eyes, and so all the context you need to understand that as a sports photo is lost with an extreme close-up. The same is true for a close-up for the most part. Unless they have a baseball cap on or a helmet or something like that, close-ups just don't do much to provide enough information about what's taking place in this sporting event, and that's why you rarely see extreme close-ups or close-ups in sports photography. You do see medium shots very frequently, and here's a medium shot of someone. Usually, a medium shot is someone's whole body or multiple people standing in proximity to each other. And so this was the example we used earlier, but it's a great example of a medium shot. You see two people in this, but you can still see the emotion on her face as she's clearly in pain. And so, yeah, this is a good medium shot. A long shot, which is sometimes called a wide shot, is when you have multiple people and you're very far away. So here's a good example of Wayne Gretzky skating around Madison Square Garden. It looks like he's saying goodbye to the fans. They're giving him a standing ovation. And we're so far away that we get the context of the standing ovation, of him being by himself and alone, right, of the spotlight on him. And that just gives us the sense of how important he is, how much reverence everybody has for him, and how he sort of stands alone as the greatest hockey player of all time, right? Yeah. So those are the elements of visual rhetoric that I really want to talk about and focus on mostly, especially the rhetoric of photography. We'll talk more about the rhetoric of video and graphics later, but sort of start thinking about photos in this way as you sort of go through them, okay? Now, what I want you to do as an activity is I want you to go find 3 photos of your own. Now, if you go to our class on Colab, go to Resources, go to Readings, and then go down. You'll see Sports Illustrated 100 Greatest Sports Photos of All Time. And that'll open this screen for you. And you can scroll through the gallery right there. And what you'll see, and it says this on your syllabus as well, I'd like you to pick 3 photos from the Sports Illustrated 100 Greatest Sports Photos of All Time and find a common rhetorical theme to discuss as part of the discussion thread called Sports Photo Breakdown, and I'll show you that in a second. So find 3 photos, find a common rhetorical theme, and then write about that theme and how it's being expressed in those photos. Then I want you to post 2 substantial and substantive responses to your classmates' posts, okay? And you can do this in discussion, and I'll show you exactly how I've done it. I have an example in there already. You go to discussions. So this is, it'll say class discussions, go to sports photo breakdown. Here's the post that I've already made. Now, if you need to, you'll click start a new conversation for yours. Okay, so click on that. And then you'll give a title, and this is where you'll write your thing. Okay. But if you open my example, you can see how I did it, right? I chose 3 photos that are all long and wide shots, one of Muhammad Ali, and I give the number in there so that people can go reference it if they want to, right? And so then I explained like why I thought wide shots were kind of interesting as they changed the perspective of those photos. Okay? So that's what you'll do as well. Okay? I want you to do that. And if you look at the syllabus, I would like you to have this done, your initial post done by 5 p.m. and all responses in by 11:59 p.m. on the 31st. Okay? If you have any examples or any questions or any concerns or anything, just please let me know. All right? Thanks, guys.